And we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the Worldwide Coalition Network here at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center. Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, and of course the mothership at coalitionradio.us. Those that have taken the time to like and to share our variety of social media offerings, to you we are profoundly grateful. Social media, indie media, it's the mother's milk. That's how we get our word out there amongst the incredible amount of noise. I haven't used the hashtag fake media in a long time. I won't tonight. But certainly, we appreciate your efforts in taking a few minutes from your day to do so. One of the things that's evolved in the show over the past 2 or 3 months is that we've been, blessed enough to meet what I call subject matter experts. People who are in academia, people who are involved in a variety of organizations, think tanks, research groups, folks who can bring to us a higher level perspective analysis because of A, their academic background, B, their day-to-day hyper focus on issues that are critical to this nation and to the world at large. Certainly at the top of that list is our good friend, Professor Andy Hernandez. He is, of course, with the Western New Mexico University. He joins us. He is an associate professor of history. As I'll always say, his focus is uniquely targeted towards both libertarians and folks who believe in civil liberties. His professorial expertise includes coursework and academic research and everything from the historical analysis of the border wars and how the Mexican-American border simply came to exist. He looks at Central American countries and their economies and discusses things like narco-terrorism, as well as some of the civil actions and civil development that takes place within those countries like Nicaragua. And of course, one of the preeminent issues of the day, immigration. And so we're blessed for his expertise and his insight, as he happens to live a mere 33 miles, I believe, from the Mexican border. So it is not just a question of academic focus. There's a real world gravitas that comes with these issues literally being part of your day-to-day life. Andy, welcome back. We're always grateful for your expertise. And I just want to lead off with one question here. We've had a couple of significant Democratic presidential debates. And forgive me if I've missed it, but the issue that was paramount on Americans' minds just a few short months ago, i.e. hashtag build that wall, seems to be completely absent from the conversation at the highest levels of the Democratic Party. What do you suppose? What's going on there?
I don't know what's going on there, but the absence is glaring. It is some of the candidates are speaking in their own forums, at their own town halls and that sort of thing on the campaign trail about the border. But it is remarkable how sanitized the debate discussions have been of issues like that. I think the only other thing that's been as glaringly absent as immigration to the border has probably been climate change.
Right.
And so both of those have been shockingly absent from the last couple of debates.
Right. And yet they allow themselves, I grew up at a time where the first and only rule of politics was never to mention your opposition. And yet these debates seem uniquely focused on he who must not be named, yet repeatedly is. And of course, we're talking about Donald J. Trump. So I don't think at this point Trump is renting space in their heads. I think he's renting condominium complexes in their heads, to which must be, in his own bizarre personality, quite delightful. I have this mental image of him a la Michael Jackson sitting back there in that famous meme, eating popcorn with his cronies and just laughing their butts off because, again, how do you ignore the border?
Essentially, the president has been able to define the narrative to such a degree that this topic has fallen off, has significantly fallen off the radar for so many people. And so essentially, there are any given number of things that will happen on any particular day, and the border has managed to stay in the background. And it seems it's all the more glaring because you can essentially look at any major issue right now and you can tie it to immigration. If we just look at Syria in the last few days, for example, there are going to be thousands of Kurds running for their lives. Where are they going to go? They're going to be heading to Europe. The ones who have the means and the ability. Some will head to Europe. I would not be surprised if some end up in the United States. And it's going to be remarkable that when that time comes, there'll probably be a complete lack of any sort of self-awareness among policymakers as to how the United States might have been responsible for these folks seeking asylum and ignoring the fact that it's certain death to return them where they came from.
Right.
It's a microcosm of the larger immigration issue.
They broke it, and they don't seem to feel the need to fix it.
No, if anything, there seem to be throughout a look at migration right now. We seem to be seeing just quite a few ways where countries are, leveraging some of their immediate interests against the long-term ones. And regrettably, you can't just say that about immigration. But
Wow. So what's going on at the border? And again, as an extension of its complete absence from the presidential debates, there was a politician who passed away a few years ago. He was somewhat legendary in northeastern circles. His name was Vincent A. Buddy Cianci, and he was the longest-serving mayor in America at one point. And he ran it sort of like a mixed bag of 1920s era mob boss meets, big city mayor meets ward boss, kind of Tammany Hall for the new millennium. And he used to joke about because in between stints in prison, he did time on talk radio, and he used to joke about vapor stories. And a vapor story is a story that, like Shark Week, would be dominant, preeminent, life-affirming, end-of-the-world type stuff, and then poof, be gone. So at least in this part of the country, and that's always been kind of a subcurrent of our conversations, how if you're in El Paso, or if you're in Deming, or if you're in LA, you look at the border from a very different perspective than if you're in Cambridge or New York City. From our perspective up here, it seems like it's all quiet on the southern front. Is that the case?
it is not. It is much more quiet than it was, say, 4 months ago, simply because you don't have shelters filled to overflowing. You don't have these visible signs of people being held in mass, waiting to be released. You have to look a bit more carefully, but you can still see those signs, most notably in Ciudad Juarez, immediately adjacent to the crossings into the United States. Mexico is spending an enormous amount of its resources right now, essentially holding asylum seekers and other migrants until they can make their initial pleas for entry into the United States.
Do you think this is timed to the elections?
I don't honestly think it's possible to be that precise in how things are timed. What I can say, though, is that it's going to come up again at least once, if not more, on the way to the next election cycle.
Trump continues to feed his base, which in light of the potential trials coming up, trials and tribulations for one Donald Trump, the only place that he's been able to hold true to his quote-unquote base is by creating the perception that he's been successful at the border. Is that success a myth?
It depends on how it's defined. If success means that you don't have migrants by the hundreds and by the thousands presenting themselves as asylum seekers at the border and surrendering and being taken in by the Border Patrol, well, sure, but that's a very limited definition of success. What's actually happened, if we just take a look, so much has been happened. I honestly am considering switching to decaf just for how quickly events seem to be escalating. But if you take a look just at the last 48 hours, the United States has signed different asylum agreements with Central America. But at the same time, if you look if we look a bit closer to our border at Mexico, um, Mexico is spending quite a bit of its resources trying to help us with our immigration problem. And it means that Mexico has become fundamentally weakened. And the most obvious place this has happened, the president of Mexico created essentially a national guard that would help to curtail narco violence, among other things, in Mexico. But those forces have largely been assigned to dealing with stemming the flow of migration. And so just then, in the last 24 hours, in Culiacan, for example, there was the horrifically public case of migrants, of the Sinaloa cartel engaged in a standing battle with the Mexican army and police forces and defeating them in the streets of Culiacan to force the release of one of El Chapo's sons,
Right.
who had been in prison. So Mexico has just had its fundamental weakness in terms of being a state, a successful state that is able to enforce laws within its borders. Nobody can take that seriously at this point.
So the very sovereignty of Mexico as a nation is, in its own very quiet, subversive way, at stake right now, isn't it?
So it is, and if we want to expand this, if we want to look at how this didn't just suddenly happen, for the last several years, the number of asylum cases and migrants from Mexico has declined to the point that there was essentially an outflow of Mexican nationals who had come to the United States and were returning to Mexico. But in the last 2 to 3 months, those numbers have increased again to the point that there's a positive inflow of migration from Mexico into the United States. And it's not just a sign of economics, it's a sign of the difficulties that Mexico has had in trying to curtail narco violence and trying to curtail kidnapping and public shootings and that sort of thing.
Has there been, with all of the war on drugs, with all of the issues that have occurred at the border, the involvement, the enhanced involvement of American paramilitary, I'll call them, the rise, if you will, of the wall, has there been any indication that the demand on drugs by the American culture has subsided at all? Or does that
There has not. Mm-hmm. I mean, and I'm sorry to just jump in right there, but no, there's no indication at all that the U.S. hunger for drugs has tapered off. What we are starting to see is that the cartels are first and foremost business people. They are trafficking in products for which there is a high demand. Mm-hmm. And as the price of drugs like marijuana has dropped significantly, and make no mistake, that's due to the actions of the states that have legalized recreational marijuana to this point. Even in New Mexico, the price has dropped for marijuana, even though recreational marijuana is not legal, just because you can get it from Colorado, you can get it from California without too much effort. But so as the lucrativeness of that cash crop has dropped off, we start to see some of the the organizations in Mexico shifting to trafficking in oil, of all things, for which, demand for that isn't going away either, and also in human trafficking, which is a much darker outlook for the shape of things to come. And I think part of this is their anticipation that the trend seems to be heading towards increased legalization of the recreational use and even the medicinal use of marijuana in more states in the coming years. Mm-hmm. And they're shifting to things that they'll still be able to make money off of.
Doesn't that, by its very existence, finally prove in the real world the notion that cultures or societies that are built on prohibition are ultimately destined for failure? I've longed for that moment in time where you could point to something and say, hey, the free market here has eliminated or curtailed black market activities there. As a result, criminality has been hampered by market forces, not by guns, not by invading Americans or anything. If that same lesson could be somehow packaged and applied to immigration itself, doesn't that have the real possibility of eliminating both the economic as well as the cultural, as well as the political, and as well as the, I'll call it the human rights and safety issues surrounding illegal immigration? Isn't it proof positive, finally?
I would like to think so. I just don't think we learned that quickly. You know, the war on drugs is as old as I am. Mm-hmm. President Nixon declared the war on drugs in 1971. And even before that moment, if you take a look just at the years immediately preceding that, mm-hmm. at the number of American troops who are returning home addicted to heroin after having been deployed to Vietnam, or if you turn it back to the decades immediately prior to that, when the use of certain drugs was racialized, right? Reefer madness, marijuana was an Hispanic drug. Those evil Mexicans, it was driving them crazy, and you didn't want to be like them.
Right.
Or even in the 80s, the crack cocaine epidemic was tied to race in California,
right,
and in other parts of the country. So I'd like to think that we're capable of learning, but we learn very slowly, and there's been so much damage just outside of the intensification of the carceral state and the incarceration rates in the United States, and the degree to which law enforcement resources have been set aside in a vain effort to try to suppress this use. Mm-hmm. And this absurd dichotomy between legal and illegal substances. It's difficult to study marijuana in the United States right now because of the prohibition, and yet it would be absurd to try to argue that marijuana will be more damaging than opiates. Right. And you look at legally prescribed opioids, covered by insurance and everything, and you can take a look at the various addiction maps that have been produced in the last few years, and that's a staggering epidemic in the United States right now. Mm-hmm.
Notwithstanding a certain comedian who has reemerged, who has one of the darkest yet funniest riffs ever on all the lessons that were preached to African Americans in the 90s, and reinventing them to be preached to white America for opioids. You know, if you folks would just be more responsible, it's wow. So
right, why can't you just follow the law?
Right,
and yet, you know, I mean, Alabama has become a state where there are more opioid prescriptions than people, and there are other regions that are not far behind that.
Mm-hmm. The emergence of regional Dr. Feelgoods reflects in its own white-collar version of a mob in and of itself, or, you know, at what point in time does it become its own reflection of narco-terrorism? So what you're telling me then is that market forces are actually driving narco-terrorism to have to find other markets, of which human trafficking is perhaps the most susceptible.
They are, and, you know, I kind of had this realization in a business class about 10 years ago. If we were talking about any legal good, if we were talking about any type of widget, the cartels, people like Ricky Ross, who made and lost fortunes in the crack market in Los Angeles, these would be business case studies in any textbook. If you would take a look at the expertise that was applied to marketing, to financing the operation, and to the actual operations and logistical management of moving product from one place to another, these would be case studies in any respecting textbook. But because they're illegal substances, naturally, instead, they're not.
Right. Because ultimately, the border is obviously a hugely differentiating factor. Excuse me, but the practices, the techniques, the violence is really just a 21st century version of Chicago, isn't it? You know, it takes place in different parts of the world, but that's only because of the growing conditions necessary and the notion that we've outsourced our drug production.
I think you could make that case, but to some degree, to varying degrees, we've outsourced the production. In some cases we have, in some cases we have not. In some cases it's big business, right? Right. The number of pharmaceuticals that produce opioids.
Mm-hmm. Yet, and I know this is an area of your expertise historically, there are a number of historical issues surrounding this contentious border we have, and that between Mexico and the United States, and it's a range of issues from parts of the United States that are culturally more Mexican ever than they could be considered American, even in the year 2019. How have historical events impacted that? Can you give us some type of perspective here?
So there's one area in particular that I've studied very closely, and this is looking at the Texas-Mexico border in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Mm-hmm. And so there are many people who are familiar with Pancho Villa's raid into New Mexico. There's certainly quite a bit of an awareness of it out here, mm-hmm. And that date is observed still every year in Columbus. There was actually a much broader low-intensity war, though, that took place along the Texas border with Mexico throughout that entire decade, where the United States had actually deployed significant amounts of troops, where there was a terrifying amount of violence. It essentially began as an operation that was encouraged by one of the generals competing to lead Mexico during the Revolution, conceived of as this plan to force the United States to recognize him. Mm-hmm. He initiated a revolutionary plan and sent operatives into Texas, who were calling for the execution of any white male above a certain age, who were calling for the border region to be restored to Mexico. Oklahoma would become an indigenous nation. This was the vision that they had, but essentially this was just a ploy by one general to be able to leverage power against the United States and ultimately to force a situation in which the United States would have to recognize him.
And to what degree did the Texas Rangers, who have become sort of our own version of the Canadian Mounties, were really a death squad? I mean,
this was the darkest moment for the Texas Rangers.
Right.
This was a moment where, now there's quite a bit of concern about human rights abuses by different branches of different agencies in the executive branch, the conditions in detention centers, and that sort of thing. This was a case where national policy did not hold any particular malice against Hispanics in the region, but when you mention some sort of genocidal war against Anglos along the border, everybody gets nervous, and there were a few dozen who were killed. But the governor of Texas, Ferguson, it was revealed a few years later, actually brought the officer in the Rangers into his office and told him that he wanted the border brought under control and offered him a blanket pardon for any actions that they had to take to do that. And so the Rangers then became, in many respects, these roving groups that in many cases were wantonly executing the first people they came across who raised any suspicions for them.
Now and I forgive my pronunciation of this, but is it Porvenir? The Porvenir massacre?
That is one, actually, but there are several. Mm-hmm. And so to this point, among academics, there's a very wide range of estimates for the number of Hispanics who were killed during this period. Mm-hmm. The estimates range anywhere from 500 to 700 up to a few thousand.
Right.
And this was, the Rangers were largely responsible for a state of terror that was imposed on much of South Texas.
So, it's always the chain of events. Who started it, right? So, in a very large degree, America absconded, if you will, with a certain significant part of Mexico, defended its rights to it under whichever doctrine you want to call it, and then you've got the reoccurrence of a Mexican federal dominance attempting to reattach itself to a variety of parts of the border. How many years did this go on, and at what point in time were Americans finally able to control the border, and by what methods?
this is so it can drive you crazy trying to find a beginning to it. And so I actually, we could do that if we had several hours.
Right.
But instead of trying to do that, the thing that stands out for me, and it's something that we still see as a major issue in foreign policy today, there are some exceptionally savvy political leaders squaring off against the United States, and they are essentially able to play American political leaders for their own ends. And that's what happened in this particular case. The general who issued this manifesto, the Plan de San Diego, it's named for a town called San Diego in South Texas.
Right.
So the general who issued this ultimately was able to turn on raids across the border and turn them off with enough reliability that he was able to convince President Wilson that he could exert control over the border and stop the violence. And so he got his recognition. And his faction in the Mexican Revolution ultimately was able to prevail. He wasn't especially interested in the suffering of the Hispanics in South Texas who were brutalized for the next several years.
Right.
And even though Carranza was an exceptionally savvy politician, there was a moment that things spun out of control in 1916, and the United States and Mexico almost went to war. I think essentially the only thing that saved us is that Mexico was too tired after nearly a decade of revolution and civil war, and Wilson knew full well that he was going to be sending forces to Europe. And that he couldn't afford to have them bogged down in South Texas for too long.
Right.
But it's something we can look at as a case study and then pile case studies on top of again over subsequent decades, all in dealing with countries throughout the world. To some degree, it looks like Turkey was able to very successfully engineer conditions right now that completely aligned with its goals, and the United States got nothing out of it. But that's one of just a long list of many. This particular incident in Mexico was another.
Wait a minute, you're saying a 5-day ceasefire isn't changing the world?
It did not, and it's what's all the more fascinating is that the U.S. keeps trying to call it a ceasefire, and the Turks have publicly stated it's not a ceasefire.
So, what ultimately? So, World War I, to a certain degree, reduced the heat in the area, if you will, and led to what? Some level of conciliation between the two. How was that conciliation arrived? Was it just an arbitrary putting down of weapons, where the Texas Rangers, brought back in to heal, or was there an actual formal treaty or negotiation?
There was not a formal treaty. Essentially, what happened. One of the distinctions between then and now is that the violence in South Texas was largely intensified due to the actions of their governor. This was not something that there was any national effort by the Wilson administration or by the U.S. Army or any national entity to intensify the violence. Essentially, it was the governor's reaction to this revolutionary plan in South Texas. And it actually got worse, even as events were getting out of control between Wilson and Mexico. There was a moment when the governor of Texas issued a proclamation that essentially said that if Hispanics in South Texas didn't make a positive demonstration of loyalty, that they would bring the wrath of the Rangers upon themselves. And they all knew full well what that meant because they had been living it.
Right.
And historically, it's an interesting thing to study because Ferguson was ultimately impeached by the Texas legislature, not because of any of this, but because he was meddling with the University of Texas. And so he was forced out of office, and in 1919, there were a series of hearings to investigate border violence in Texas, and that was the low point for the Rangers when a lot of this came to light. Now, even though the Rangers faced some repercussions for this, you have to emphasize there were so many other issues. There was a Texas politician, Canales, who essentially pushed for these hearings. He was threatened publicly by Rangers and their sympathizers. Ultimately, he was forced from office not that long thereafter, and it wasn't until the 1950s, 1960s that Texas had Hispanics elected to statewide office. That's several decades of time in which Hispanics in Texas were still dealing with the legacy of this.
Right. Right. And, if you look at the massacre that happened at Porvidor, I mean, that really didn't even get officially recognized or discussed or memorialized really until the last, I believe, 10 years. I mean, we're
Correct.
we're at 100 years plus, and these are still simmering, if you will. There are folks alive who are still, only a few, direct descendants of of people who were massacred. And in that case, an entire village was essentially lined up and executed, according to witness accounts of the time.
So there are, it is rising a bit in consciousness. There was a commemorative conference this year for those 1919 hearings that tried to assess what exactly had happened along the border. This sort of thing is passed down by families in Texas, and there are a set of historians that continue to study this.
What though, and I guess this is the million-dollar question, if you will, what is the legacy of that? I mean, it's 2019 now. We are, 100 years past those hearings. How much of today's border tensions and the overall cultural tensions that may or may not exist, and again, my stay in Deming was so incredibly brief. I mean, I can't begin, and another reason why we value your expertise is very often the symptoms, the issues of cultural misogyny, for lack of a better word, don't take place in the history books. It takes place in the normal interactions between people and communities or sub-communities that live in the immediate area. It's again, the border it strikes me from my brief engagement with Deming, New Mexico, the border is an everyday presence, yet in your life, yet at the same time, it's not nearly as relevant as you would think in certain issues. Its relevance is in the day-to-day aspects of your life, less so than this huge looming presence. That's what it strikes me as an outsider. What impact did this have all this on the communities that still live in and around New Mexico, Texas, and northern Mexico?
So somebody may jump out and correct me 5 minutes after this airs. From what I have seen so far, there's not really a legacy of animosity along the border from those events of a century ago. Instead, it seems perhaps even worse that we seem hell-bent on compiling a different set of mistakes now, proceeding from a different set of assumptions and a different set of circumstances. So you were in Palomas. Did you have a chance to eat at the Pink Store while you were down there?
We were down the street. We were short on time, so we did not go to the Pink Store. It was very early.
Okay.
So I don't at all want to be disparaging, but the immediate poverty that I saw, and the difference, literally, in 30 miles, was profound.
And the only point that I was going to raise as far as the question of memory, there is a very famous photo in 1914 where Pancho Villa was at Fort Bliss. And he's got this big grin on his face, and he's standing next to General Pershing, who also has a big grin on his face, who's also standing next to Alvaro Obregón, who also has a big grin, less of a grin on his face. He was a bit more stolid. But, the cruel irony here was that those three at various points were trying to kill each other just a few years later when things had turned. It was a fascinating illustration of when friends can become enemies very quickly. But the reason I brought it up is because there is a statue in Palomas commemorating the moment where Villa and Pershing were at Fort Bliss shaking hands. And so even though there's a much darker set of events that came just a few years after that, that seems to be more where the focus is in terms of how to remember.
Right. There is a tendency by I'll call it northern United States, to be culturally be pretty condescending to folks in Mexico. They are not nearly aware of the history. They are not nearly aware of the cosmopolitan nature of Mexico City, the amount of industry that has popped up. They look at border poverty in some of the, the more rural areas, and they have a tendency to conflate that and project that onto the rest of Mexico. Do we continue to do that at our own risk? At what point in time, I think there's a lesson to be learned here with the Kurds. Quite frankly, the Kurds have worked closely with the United States in stabilizing a region, one of the most challenging regions on the planet, a buffer, if you will, for the, we tend to think of that special relationship with certain countries in very absolute terms. But as was pointed out this week in graphic detail to us, that the Mexicans owe us nothing. And if the Mexican government is continually forced to destabilize as a result of narco-terrorism, which is a direct result of American consumer demand, at what point in time do nations like Mexico say, for lack of a better term, screw this, I'm going to talk to China? And what could be more terrifying in our foreign relations than to have a Chinese influence in Central and Latin America? And are we in any danger of that?
There's already a considerable degree of Chinese influence in Latin America.
Right.
The Belt and Road Initiative, I know that's the colloquial term for it, but the Infrastructure Initiative, there are several nations in Latin America that are benefiting from that very generously. China's investing billions of dollars in Latin America, in Africa, all throughout Asia. Mm-hmm. The Chinese influence is already there.
Right.
So this dovetails into a few other things that I've looked at too, because one geopolitical issue is that China has been very adept at using foreign aid to gradually sever support for Taiwan,
right,
which has been, the two Chinas has been the cornerstone of U.S. policy for decades now. Mm-hmm. But look at Central America for a moment. Central America actually has an abundance of the dwindling number of nations on the map that still recognize Taiwan officially. Mm-hmm. Another area of research that I looked at, I will send you some of the photos that I compiled in Nicaragua. There was a Chinese company that many folks were suspicious was heavily supported by the PRC that had proposed building an interoceanic canal across Nicaragua. And so that effort was one in a series of initiatives undertaken by the Ortega government that eroded conditions in that country, especially for mixed-blooded peoples and natives, mm-hmm. that contributed to the violence that we saw explode last year. To look a little further south, Panama had previously also been one of, Nicaragua still recognizes Taiwan, by the way. Panama, though, withdrew its recognition about a year ago. And that announcement, quite coincidentally, I'm sure, coincided with the announcement of massive infrastructure investment by China into the Panama Canal and other major projects in Panama.
Right.
So during the Cold War, it would have been unthinkable for the United States to allow any nation to start to exert that kind of financial influence over Latin America. And now it's not a cause for concern at all.
Which is crazy. I mean, we running a foreign policy that, and again, I'm not an expert. I literally try to play one on the radio, but it strikes me that the current administration's foreign policy has this sort of is blind to the notion of how fragile the economic ties between us and these quote-unquote Central American, Latin American countries are, and the devastating impact that could have to us if in fact it ever came to war. He seems to feel that he can do whatever the hell he wants and not worry about consequences. And boy, did we just get taught a lesson this week.
We have been taught a lesson this week, but you have to understand with Latin America, this has gone on for more than a century now.
Right.
The United States militarily intervened in Nicaragua 3 different times
Right.
in the first half of the 20th century to be sure that nobody else could build a canal there because that threatened our national security.
Right.
We intervened in Panama and helped to sever that from Colombia so that we could have a canal.
Right.
These were just interventions on behalf of U.S. national security interests.
Right.
There were many other interventions on behalf of U.S. business interests.
But will we ever be in a position to do that again, if not that we want to be, if in fact there's the presence of other foreign superpowers troops, whether they be in the form of advisors, all right, or not? I mean, and again, it strikes me that we take too much for granted the Western nature, if you will, of Central and Latin America. And a poor country will turn to, well, again, look what happened with
the piece that I published on Nicaragua earlier this year. There are military advisors in Nicaragua from Russia. The Russians have provided Nicaragua with tanks and jet fighters on very generous financial terms. They helped. They invested in a drug interdiction center in Managua that I suspect is essentially a center to train in counterintelligence operations, and that this is why the Sandinista government has been so effective at murdering the opposition in the last year. That has not gained much notice in the United States. But I think something that does keep me awake is that periodically over the last 15 years, the United States has raised concerns that Managua is also improving relations with Iran. And there were the same folks who got us into Iraq in 2003. They and their disciples were raising concerns about Iranian influence in Managua in 2007 and 2008 and 2009. And fortunately, that even though there was bipartisan concern there, that didn't escalate to the point where people were talking, where people were able to effectively make the case for intervention. But I don't know what would happen 5 years from now.
Right.
Except to say that I do know that these nations will continue to improve their relations with Latin America. And I think the issue perhaps for us is if the point comes where a subsequent administration decides to make an issue out of it.
We used to point to nations like Cuba and to a lesser degree Nicaragua as client states. That was a scary word back in the 70s and 80s, right before that peace dividend we were supposed to get. Are any of these nations, well, Cuba, but I mean to a certain degree, are any of these nations still client states? And is that term even used anymore?
It's one of those terms that is used from time to time, but it's fallen out of disuse in general because it's lost its meaning. It was largely a Cold War construct.
Right.
Of course, at this point, it's hard to say that the Cold War hasn't restarted.
Right.
But there were some remarkable instances, even though Cuba was identified as a client state, for example. So I just mentioned that Nicaragua has been able to purchase MiG fighters from Russia on very favorable terms. In 1984, there was a moment where the Sandinista government attempted to do the same thing, and the Reagan administration declared that would be an act of war. If the Soviets sold those fighters to Nicaragua and if they accepted them, the United States would intervene. And Fidel Castro was actually the statesman in the room because those fighters, as near as we can tell, were shipped through the Baltic Sea, through the Atlantic, and then the freighters docked in Cuba to deliver other supplies. And Fidel impounded those fighters because he knew that the case seems to be clear that Fidel was aware that Russia and Nicaragua were prepared to make an issue out of this, and Fidel realized very clearly that wasn't in anybody's interest.
I just wonder, particularly with this administration, if in fact if someone drew a line in the sand and actually said a certain behavior would be an act of war, I'm not sure what would happen. As narco-terrorism has replaced conventional operating governments, and as you point out so aptly, Mexico status as a functional government is being challenged now because of this battle for resources, fighting narco-terrorism, at the same time controlling the border on behalf of the Americans. I'm just not sure what would happen.
I'm not sure either. One tragic thing about Mexico, we started this conversation by talking about how some issues seem to fall off of our notice. Mm-hmm. Some of my colleagues were openly suggesting in 2006, 2007 that Mexico was a failed state. Mm-hmm. And there's been enough window dressing in the intervening years where it hasn't been as obvious how close Mexico was teetering to that designation. Mm-hmm. But, after last night's attack in Culiacan, that sort of assessment is back right at the forefront.
So Americans need to wake themselves out of their impeachment slumber, look at that attack, read, draw distinctions, create an understanding, while simultaneously, I believe, wondering if in fact the nation is headed for some even sort of mild recession, cyclical as it may be, what impact that will have on the Mexican economy, because in the intervening years, we've outsourced so much of our production, automobiles, manufacturing, at all, to the Mexican state. So the combination, if you will, that perfect storm of even a mild recession combined with the military pressures of maintaining multiple borders at the bequest of the Americans, while simultaneously trying to contain, I'm not even saying fight, but contain narco-terrorism. I look for confluences to happen. When you have exogenous events come together in one finite period of time, the ripple effect in and of itself can be staggering. And I just wonder if Mexico is poised for that.
It is, but it's not alone.
Oh, good. Oh, my.
Sorry to, if we go full circle and return to migration now, the United Nations report on migration and refugee seekers last year was terrifying, because essentially the number of displaced peoples in the world right now is second only to World War II in recorded history.
Wow.
And let's go back to Mexico now for a moment. Before the attack in Culiacan, I was shaking my head because, while Mexico is essentially enforcing our immigration policy at this point, Mexican immigration officials detained and returned 311 Indians to New Delhi who had entered into Mexico with the intent of continuing on to the United States. Mm-hmm. So this is part of the reason that UN report is so terrifying to me, because our focus right now is in too many circles is just on Central America, mm-hmm. Which means that we've neglected Mexico, except that Mexico is demanding attention right now. And while this is going on, there are people from India who are trying to enter through Mexico in order to emigrate or to claim asylum or any number of other issues. Mm-hmm. The suicide in a detention center in North Louisiana this past week was of a Cuban asylum seeker, mm-hmm. who had actually passed his hearing indicating that he was legitimately afraid for his life and faced death if he returned home, but he still had not been paroled. The two who slashed their wrists in a New Mexico holding facility just 2 days ago, those were also Cubans.
And I will tell you that the folks that we met in Palomas were all Cubans, and Cubans who had not been able to get, obviously even to square one. And in fact, I know for a fact that even in it's been about a month and a half, those folks are still, because we just spoke to people in Deming this past week, those folks are still in Palumas, living day to day, trying to figure out a way to simultaneously either get over or make sure, most importantly, that they don't get sent back because they had come through Brazil.
Yes. And so the absurdity of our immigration policy on top of this, Cuba is a nation that the United States has sanctioned. We have employed an embargo against Cuba since the 1960s. Trump intensified sanctions against Cuba once he became president. This is a nation that the United States has long contended. It stands out for human rights violations, for a very effective police state for surveillance on its own citizens. And yet these are people who are not recognized as having made the case to enter the United States to ask for asylum.
We're out of time for tonight, but it does come full circle. The times that we've spoken, ultimately, it starts with a failed immigration policy. We work through a separate set of events or circumstances or history, and ultimately, by the end of the night, we are back at the same spot, which is our failure as a nation to recognize whether it was created by our own stupidity, short-sightedness, or whether exogenous events interfered, our own inability to recognize the displacement of individuals taking place is not something that can just be simply ignored and not expect far-reaching either foreign policy, military, or even civil consequences as a result. And we continue to do so at our own risk as a nation by literally putting our heads in the sand and thinking that somehow this could just continue as is. And yet perhaps our conversation next time will be about all the potential issues that will rise up, whether it be, again, civil in nature, the violence, the potential border issues, being drawn into conflicts that will result in our continued ignorance of our immigration policy. And to the point that we started out with at the very beginning of the night, no less of an ignorance, if you will, as being perpetrated on that issue is taking place in the contest for some would still call the ruler of the free world, the presidency of the United States. We continue to ignore that. Wow.
We do, and I'm not optimistic that it's going to come up at the next debate either. These seem to be very carefully sanitized.
That's why you need some of those liberalitarians in the race. We'll and
I'll hold you to that.
I want you to just keep it in the back of your mind as we sit up there with 12 of them up there. When the debate commission comes around, I think they just announced the first debate to happen at Notre Dame. I want you to remember the last couple of debates, and when they say that we can't possibly have 3 people on the stage. That will water down the arguments. Okay.
It will.
Wow. Well, again, thank you for this incredible tour of these issues. Again, your ability to make accessible that which is the complex, the obscure, yet critically important, is just. So I still want to one day take one of your classes.
We might be able to arrange that, Pat.
All right. I want to sit in just for one day. I promise to be quiet. I promise to be well behaved. Okay. I promise not to go out the night before. I promise all of that. Well, thank you again, Professor Andy Hernandez. He of the Western New Mexico University. He's a member of the Social Science and Cultural Studies faculty and staff. Teaches an astonishing array of courses. I think one of the things we have to do in anticipation of next semester, and I've kept my producer way too long, is the courses that are online. When we next get together, I want to put out there and see if I can get you some remote students. How about that?
That would be. We have students from a wide range of places, but we're always welcoming more.
All right. Well, again, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Always a pleasure. Take care, Pat.
We'll talk soon.
Sounds good.
So, I want to thank Joe, first of all, for staying with us. We're 10 minutes past due. I'm sorry. The conversation was too good. We are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage, porn-free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Media Network here at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center. Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, on the mighty, mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, and of course, the mothership at coalitionradio.us. keep an eye on our site for the next day or two. We're going to be talking about a local issue that we've discussed before. We've done a little bit of reporting, and we're going to share that with you this weekend. We'll see you next week.